Hi there, this is Sue Glenn. We're going to be talking about species distributions today. This is Chapter 9, the chapter on population distribution and abundance from Manuel Molles and Anna Sher's book, Ecology, Concepts and Applications. It's the 8th edition, 2019. And up until now, the presentations have been dealing with the interrelationships between environmental factors and the individual. And now we're talking about the population, which is a group of individuals of a species that are found in a specific area. When we're looking at populations, there's a number of reasons why we would be studying different populations, things at the population level instead of the individual level. It gives us information that can help us save endangered species, might help us controlling a species that we don't want in an area that we call a pest population, helps us manage populations that we use. So this could be fish, this could be game species. And also helps us to understand our own human population and ways of controlling our population growth, which is really at the heart of all of our environmental problems. So we're going to be focusing today on the distribution of population, which is the size, the shape, the location of the area that species population is in. And the size of this, the scale of this is going to depend very much on the kind of species you're talking about. Populations also, sometimes we talk about the density. So in ecology, when we're talking about population density, we're talking about the number of individuals per unit area, as opposed to in chemistry, you talk about density, that's a weight per volume. So it's a different definition. Populations, sometimes you talk about the age distributions, the growth rates, as well as the distribution and abundance. And so we have 3 chapters here that we'll be going over all of these aspects of looking at population. So when we're looking at the limits of a distribution of a species, we know that organisms can compensate for changes in the environment by regulating their body temperature and regulating their water content and foraging in different ways, allocating energy to foraging that would maintain their energy levels. But we can only compensate for so much. And so being unable to compensate for environmental factors in certain areas may limit our distribution to that area. So the physical environment will limit the geographic distribution of the species. And the real reason for this is that the metabolic cost for compensating for that environmental variation, that environmental factor, just may take up too much of the organism's energy budget and just then is not going to have the energy to survive and reproduce. So organisms can only compensate for so much environmental variation. There's no single species on the planet that can tolerate the full range of Earth's environment. So the diversity of life is really a diversity of strategies for dealing with this variation in the environment. One of the things we talk about when we are dealing with how organisms are related to the environmental limits is the idea of a niche or a niche, however you like to pronounce that. And that's all the environmental factors that influence the growth, the survival, and the reproduction of a species. So these are the ranges in those environmental factors that the species can actually live in, survive in. And when it was originally defined by Joseph Grinnell early in the 20th century, it was really focused on the effects of the environmental factors, temperature, moisture, precipitation, light, was the idea of a physical niche. However, Charles Elton, who independently sort of came up with this idea, used the idea in a slightly different way. He was looking at the idea that the biological interactions were just as influential as the abiotic factors. So that the idea is that other species can be limiting where you're found as well. So it might be that you could live perfectly in a certain environment. Let's say a kangaroo could live perfectly in tropical rainforests of northern Australia, but doesn't because of other factors. Maybe it's diseases, maybe it's predators, maybe it's a food source. So the biotic factors are just as important as the abiotic factors. Hutchinson in the 1950s came up with a definition of the niche. And just to put Hutchinson into perspective, remember you had learned about Robert MacArthur. MacArthur had worked with the warblers that we talked about in the first chapter, and had also worked on optimal foraging that we had talked about in the energy chapter. MacArthur worked with Hutchinson, so obviously Hutchinson has been working with this concept of the niche, and the niche has been important when we were talking about the warblers. Hutchinson defined the niche as an n-dimensional hypervolume where n is the number of environmental factors important to the survival and reproduction of a species. So the hypervolume is not one dimension, two dimensions, three dimensions. It's as many dimensions as are important to that species to survive and reproduce. And so the fundamental niche of the species defines the physical conditions under which a species might live in the absence of other species. However, because of competition with other species, or interactions with other species, predation, disease, competition, you might not be able to live in all the places you possibly could live. And so the species ends up being in more restricted conditions, which is called the realized niche, which is the actual niche of a species whose distribution is limited by biotic interactions such as competition, predation, disease, parasitism. And so there's a lot of factors that are sort of put into this idea of the niche, and you're taking a lot of complexity of the environment and pulling it together into one concept. The example that they talk about when they're talking about distribution limits, then looking at this at a really a fairly large scale, all of the continent of Australia, is looking at the relationship between kangaroos and climate. So kangaroos and wallabies are in the family Macropodidae. Macropods, they have big feet. Macro feet, pods, their feet. Macro's big, pods are their feet. And everybody knows what these animals are like. But there's some little ones as well. There's rat kangaroos and tree kangaroos, and lots of different species of them. They're found all across Australia, but there's no species found everywhere. So the kangaroos sort of have Australia divided up into different sections. This was a study done in the 80s by Colley, and what he was looking at was the distribution between distribution patterns between three different species of kangaroos in Australia. So Colley was looking at Macropus giganteus, which is your eastern grey kangaroo, which is confined to the eastern third of Australia. And the eastern third of Australia has a lot of different biomes. It has temperate forests in the southeast, tropical forests in the north, mountains, which have a lot of variety in ecosystems, as well in the center part of the range. And this is quite a variable set of biomes, but it doesn't have a lot of seasonality in the precipitation, and so it pretty much has constant precipitation throughout the year. Then we have the western grey, which is obviously going to be in western regions of Australia and is actually in southern and western regions. And this is found in the Mediterranean woodland and shrubland biome that we learned about in the biome chapter. And so that has, remember that biome had very seasonal precipitation, winter rainfall. And then the third one, Macropus rufus, is the red kangaroo. And the red kangaroo wanders around the middle of Australia. It is in the very dry, the arid and semi-arid interior of Australia, which is savanna and desert biomes. And this is the one that really occupies the largest area. So what he had done was he mapped out where all these kangaroos were found by using surveys that they had of various types. And this was all done on paper maps. And then he took all the climate data to look at the relationship between the patterns, the boundaries of these patterns of distribution of these species. And it's all done by hand. You think about what this was done in the 80s. The computer systems that we had then are not nearly up to the scale that we have computer systems now. So it would be a lot easier to do now than it was then. And when you look at these three species of kangaroo, between the three of them, they cover a lot of Australia, but they have got it divided up into. So as I said, they have Australia divided up into the different areas, even though these kangaroos occupy most of the continent. Eastern greys in a lot of biomes in the east, the western greys in south and western regions in the Mediterranean biome with winter rainfall, and the red kangaroo in the deserts and savannas in the interior of Australia. Saying all this doesn't probably make it visually very accessible, So here we have the map from your chapter where you're looking at the distribution of these three species of kangaroo, and we have the eastern kangaroo, the eastern gray, whose picture's at the top right, and he's found in the variety of biomes across eastern Australia. We have the western gray, who's found in western and southern Australia in the Mediterranean woodland type biomes, chaparral. And then we have in the lower left side, we've got the red kangaroo, who is living all across the center of Australia in that arid and semi-arid environment. So they are found in very distinct different geographic distributions that is determined by the climate. However, even though the climate is influencing their distribution, the climate is probably affecting the food, the water supply, habitat, probably parasites, competitors, pathogens, other things that could be influencing where these distributions start and stop. So, so even though we know that ultimately it could be the climate, the more proximal reason could be some of these other factors. So limited distributions may not be directly determined by climate. The climate can often influence species distributions through their food and water, their habitat availability, and the incidence of other species they interact with, such as parasites, pathogens, and competitors. So we're going to talk about another species that we've mentioned, tiger beetles, before. And we looked at them and how they were regulating their body temperatures on black sand beaches in New Zealand. That was back in chapter 6. We looked at their water loss rates in Arizona as well. So here we're looking at a tiger beetle distribution of a species that lives at higher latitudes and higher elevations than just about any other tiger beetle in North America. And they looked at how were they able to live in these colder places, and they found that their metabolic rates are higher So they preferred temperatures that were lower than most other species. They were basically able to keep themselves warmer than other species of tiger beetles. And so when you look at the physical environment limiting the species distribution, this guy could be found further up, higher in mountains and further north. And when we look at the distribution of this tiger beetle, then there's a nice picture of him. And we can see that he's found all across the boreal forest, even up as far as Yukon Territory and Canada, and then we can find him further north, but sorry, further south, but up on the mountains. So we see him on the coastal range and the Rocky Mountains, and it's found in the mountain forests and the mountain meadows. So we can get them down here in Maine, and we can get them all the way up there in the Yukon. And no matter where we find them, we've got these ones that are in Arizona and some further north in Maine and Wisconsin. No matter where we find them, they have a preferred body temperature of 34 degrees Celsius. So if you're going to find them further south, they're up in the mountains. They're finding their location in that uh, a habitat where it's much cooler, so they're able to keep their body temperatures constant no matter where you find them. Okay, the next chapter, or the next section of the chapter, is going over the distribution of plants along a moisture temperature gradient, looking at some really cool plants in California and Arizona. And as fascinating as my videos are, I think you need to watch this video. You should pause here, watch the video 113 degree oven botany with Encilia farinosa. Here's the YouTube location of it. Okay, his language is colorful, but he talks about these plants in a much more lively way and a better way than I can. And I strongly suggest that you subscribe to his YouTube channel. It's called Crime Pays, but Botany doesn't. And here's the link to this YouTube channel. The discussion or the description says a lowbrow, crass approach to plant ecology as muttered by a misanthropic Chicago Italian. Plants and rocks are the skin of the earth, and awareness of the photosynthetic elements around you serves as a nice reprieve from the nausea, homicidal thoughts, anxiety, and monotony of life in today's bleak society. So pause here, take a look at 113 degree oven botany with Encilia farinosa. Well, I hope you really enjoyed that video by Tony, and hopefully the language doesn't put you off, because his videos are absolutely amazing. And now you know all about Encilia farinosa, the brittle bush that he was showing you. Here's a picture of it. And in your textbook, they talk about its distribution along the moisture temperature gradient and the research that he was actually talking about in that video. So I don't need spend a lot of time on this. If we look at the distribution of the different species then of Encilia, we can find that they are found from the coast of California all the way into the Arizona deserts, and we have basically the Californica species lives in sort of the cooler weather that is along the California coast. So it's a little bit cooler and moister in the north and cool and dry in the south. Then the Actoni is further inland, so you find the Actoni where it's a little bit drier and warmer. And then we have Farinosa and Fructexans, and they overlap quite a bit in their distributions in the area where we've got quite a bit of dry desert. And so that's the area where that video was taken. And then the concern is, well, how can they compete with each other in such an environment? When we look at two species of the Encelia, the one that was in the video that they talked about was the Farinosa, and that had the little hair-like structures on the leaves that reflected the light, so it keeps it from warming up quite so much. So if we look at the Farinosa, that's the lower line with the yellow dots. The Farinosa then has much less light absorption. So these are the x-axis are the different wavelengths of light, and we can see the Farinosa has much less light absorption than the Fructescens, which is the upper line, and the Fructescens absorbs a lot more light. It doesn't have those little hairs. It's a non-pubescent variety, so it's going to heat up a lot more. So how does that Fructescens survive in this desert if it's going to be overheating like that? So this is looking at those little hairs on Farinosa, and I give the plant a nice coloring that it looks much more silvery from reflecting all of that light. And then if you look at the leaves of the Fructescens, they are dark green. They're not hairy. And so they're going to be absorbing a lot more light, and they're going to be heating up. Now, when you look at this area of the desert where these things are growing, you find that the Fructescens is actually in a slightly different habitat. And once again, microclimate becomes important, microhabitats become important. The Fructescens will grow down in these washes, and these washes are places where when it does rain, the water will flow. And so they are going to put their roots deep down in these washes. Most of them are completely below ground. Remember, it's allocating energy to get something that's hard to find, and that would be water in this case, and it is tapping into the groundwater. Because of that, it can maintain high rates of transpiration, and it can cool itself with the evaporation of the water from the leaves. The Farinosa, it doesn't have such a deep root system. It's got a much more shallow root system. So we find the Farinosa away from these washes is growing up on the edges of the washways, and it's able to survive there with less water because it's not going to heat up. It's got this nice reflection of the light off of the leaves. So even though their broad distributions overlap, when you actually look at a smaller scale, you can see their distributions are actually quite separate from each other. They are in different habitats within the same area. Here we can see students that are sampling the Encelia fructescens. So they're sampling the vegetation along transects in this desert wash area where the rains would come during infrequent rain event. And then we have up on the slopes, you have the Encelia farinosa, which we were talking about having the little hairs on the leaves to reflect the light. So that's the Now for something completely different, we're going to go from the desert and we're going to go into the intertidal zone. So you know you've been down to the shore, you know the tide goes in and out depending on the pull of the moon, and sometimes you get really big tides because it depends on the pull of the sun and the moon together, and sometimes the tide goes out and exposes the organisms that are living there. So we're going to talk about barnacles, which live on the rocks in the intertidal zone. They'll also grow on the piers, they'll grow on boats, they'll grow on the outside of whales. So organisms that live in the intertidal zone have evolved to different degrees of resistance to drying, and different species of barnacles have a different amount of resistance. So what barnacles will do is they'll shut their little shells when the tide goes out, and they can sit there and sort of keep as moist as they can as they wait for the tide to come back in. Then they will reopen their little shells, send out their little tentacles to start feeding on the plankton and debris in the water. Joseph Connell did some very famous research on competition. We're going to talk about this in later chapters when we talk about competition. But he was looking in Scotland at barnacles, and he found that there were clear zones of barnacles as you're going down the rocks towards the wetter part of the intertidal zone. And we found the Chthalmus stellatus was just restricted to the upper levels. It's got like little black tentacles that come out. And then if you go further down, you find the Balanus balanoides is in the middle to lower levels and has little white tentacles. And so what he saw is that as the barnacles grew, the blue lines or the blue bars are the chithalamus and the green bars are the balanus. And he found that the age of the average age of the barnacles is on the x-axis, and their mortality is on the y-axis. And they found that warm weather and calm seas caused a lot of mortality amongst the Balanus balanoides than the Chithalamus during in the upper intertidal zone, which means that where it tends to dry out more, the Balanus was not doing as well in competition with the Chithalamus. It was dying off, whereas the Chithalamus had a much lower mortality rate. By the time they get big enough, 2 years old, the Chithalamus was almost no mortality in that upper intertidal zone. So it was able to withstand the drying out and still be competitively active. So it turns out that the Balanus is much more vulnerable to drying out and excludes it from the upper intertidal zone. So you just find the Chithalamus in the upper one and the Balanus down in the lower one. The Chithalamus adults appear to be excluded from the lower areas, though, by competition with Balanus. So Balanus has an advantage where it doesn't dry out as much, whereas Chithalamus has an advantage that it can survive being dried out. One of the things you have to check is, well, maybe the Balanus can't even get up where the Chithalamus are. Maybe they are just restricted to that lower intertidal zone. But this is looking at that the larvae of the Balanus, they can get up to the highest levels, the little baby ones. So when they reproduce, they spew their larvae out into the water, and they can get to all zones, the Balanus. But as adults, we can see that the Balanus adults can't really survive as well up between those high neap tides and spring tides, and whereas the Chithalamus adults are able to survive in those high spring tides, but not down below between the average tides to the high neap tides. So we can see a difference in where the larvae are able to go versus where the adults are able to survive. So the adults will attach onto a rock and have to basically maintain that territory. The next section of the chapter, we're going to be talking about patterns on small scales. And stay tuned for that presentation. If you didn't watch the video from Crime Pays but Botany Doesn't, go ahead and do that. And I also put a fun video about Connell's research on the barnacles as well on the playlist on YouTube.